Hey there, aficionados. Kevin here from N.O.A.H, Northern Ontario Aquarium Hobby. Welcoming you to another installment of
Foundations in Aquascaping.
Today we're going to be talking all about flow, circulation, moving the water around your tank. Considering, what we do here, all in this water, it seems like something that should be coming to our minds readily all the time. A lot of people tend to overlook the importance of flow, or might not consider it. We look at filtration, and we understand that our filters are for mechanical and biological filtration, and we've got the intake and the outtake, and that the water is flowing into our filters and cleaning our water for us, for our fish and for our plants. And a lot of times that's all that we think about when it comes to circulation in our tanks, and we don't think about the benefits of the actual movement of the water. And as we go through it, you're going to find out there's quite a few things that really need to be considered, especially in the planted tank hobby, to get the most benefits out of moving that water around. Now, as I mentioned, the thing that we often think about, and probably the simplest aspect of this, is filtration. Yes, as the water's flowing around, we want to make sure that we've got good circulation so that we're able to draw bad water or still water from dead points in our tank and draw it into our filter to clean it out. We want to make sure, that there are no dead points, and this is the reason for coming up with the flow, because again, those dead points are places where you're going to start running into your problems. This is where you're going to have detritus build up. This is where you're going to have most of your algae blooms starting are in dead zones in the water, areas where the water's not flowing through it properly. Now, the way I like to think of it myself is that flow, circulation, it's sort of like the circulatory system in the body. If your blood is flowing well and flowing properly throughout the body, you're going to be healthy. Your blood's bringing oxygen to different parts of your body, feeding your muscles, bringing vitamins and nutrients and everything that we're taking in, giving us energy. But if we have any constriction points, any clogging or anything like that, then that leads to health problems. It's exactly the same thing when we're looking at flow or circulation in our tanks. If the water is flowing properly and without restriction, then you're going to have a healthy tank, or you're on your way to a healthy tank. Obviously, there's a lot of other variables, but this is a very big part of it. And conversely, if we have constriction points or bad flowing parts, it's going to create issues. So to sort of back it up there for a second, keeping detritus and animal waste and plant waste from settling into a certain area is one of the big important factors in creating proper flow in your tank. If you've got a dead area where the flow isn't happening, or you don't have strong enough circulation in your tank, then that detritus will settle into an area and create pockets of decomposition that are unbalanced throughout the rest of your tank, and those are going to turn into problem spots for you, because that extra decomposition in detritus is going to lead to an excess of nutrient and minerals that may not necessarily get taken up by your tank, by your plants in your tank. As well, that is going to give a really fertile ground for algae to start growing on, because one of the main things that cause algae are usually too much of something, too little of something, but in this case, too many nutrients built up in one specific area. If it's not being taken up by your plants, then algae is a very opportunistic problem, and it will find those areas and it will start to build up there. And you've probably noticed this in some of your tanks, say something like green dust algae, just even building up on your glass. You'll find you're going to see it start more in your corners or in parts where there isn't necessarily a lot of flow. Now, it isn't just because those areas are tucked away and we don't necessarily clean them as much, although that can play into it. The reason it starts there is because those are build-up areas, those are problem areas where the algae can attach to that detritus. So having a good flow allows that detritus to not settle into one specific area and to be maybe evenly distributed across all of your substrate, which then in turn can create fertilization for your plants. Now and again, talking about detritus moving around, not only can you have those problem spots, those dead zones, if you don't have significant flow, that detritus can also land on your plants and begin to coat them. Now, it's not really to the extent perhaps that I'm going to be expressing it, but that buildup of detritus on the leaves of your plants can slow down photosynthesis, because you're clogging out the leaves. You're clogging out the space where the leaves are absorbing this energy, as well as blocking out some of that sun. Now again, some of the sun or some of your lights, it's not as strong of an issue, but having that detritus build up there again allows for algae to set in on your leaves, and a place for the opportunistic algae to find that sort of food source that the plants aren't able to take up because they're in too great amounts. So again, having a bad flow allows detritus to settle on your plants and to settle in those dead zones, creating that opportunistic algae explosions. Now, where flow is good at moving around the waste products, like detritus, evenly, so that you don't have areas where it's building up, it's obviously also essential in moving nutrients about in the water. Any of the fertilizers that we're putting into it. Now, obviously within a water system, the same as within the air, us mixing those fertilizers in, eventually, yes, they will dissipate throughout the entire water column. However, they don't dissipate quickly and as evenly as possible without a good sort of flow. I mean, if you take even a glass of water and just drop some food coloring in it, you're going to see it sort of fall in that one spot and just sort of stir around in that one little area, because it's a different density than the water. Likewise, our fertilizers are in some ways a different density than our water. Now, it's not quite as an extreme example as that, but if we're just plunking our fertilizer in without having significant flow, the fertilizer is going to just sort of slowly dissipate, and there's going to be areas where it's focusing and not really necessarily getting to your entire tank. Now, as we talked about in planted substrates, having the planted substrate video, having substrate with a high CEC, the ability to hold on to nutrients later for plant uptake. If you have your fertilization, your liquid dosing or your dry dosing being flowed evenly throughout all of your tank, then it's of course going to be able to be absorbed evenly into your substrate, which means it's going to be able to be delivered evenly to your plant base. So before I get into talking about gas exchange, temperature again is something to be considered. No matter the size of the tank, this is especially noticeable in larger tanks, of course, but no matter the size of the tank, this definitely matters. Typically we have one, maybe two heat sources in our tanks. Our heater, the heater is obviously heating up the water around it. Now, of course, water is fluid by its very nature, and heat does emanate from that heat source and begin to flow into the tank. However, water is really not that great of a conductor of temperature in the way that we may see air, being obviously a much lighter medium. So if you don't have significant flow, you run the risk of having different temperature zones in your tanks. So centered around your heater, you'll have that warmer temperature, And at the other end of the tank, it can be significantly cooler. And I mean, one of the habits that a lot of people have is putting the thermometer at the far end of the tank away from the heater, you know, trying to get an accurate read of, well, okay, we don't want it right at the heat source, we want it away. So and we sort of have in our head, well, if our heater over here is reading that we're in the optimal temperature that we want to be at, then that must mean that the entire tank then is being heated evenly. That's not necessarily the case, because if you don't have good flow, that means that the area around your heater is actually higher than the optimal range that you want it to be at, so you're getting these hot zones. Now, as we know, the gaseous exchange that occurs in our tank occurs entirely at the surface. What happens is the naturally occurring or injected CO2, depending on which method you're using, comes to the surface, and as it breaks the surface, then the water absorbs oxygen, and there's a gas exchange, CO2 for oxygen, and that's how we oxygenate the water in our tank. Now, there's different methods for doing that, having bubblers, or with hang-on back filters, you're agitating the surface of the water. But even with your canister filters, if they're put properly in the right place, you're going to be creating that surface agitation. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a hard breaking of the surface of the water, like a rolling bubble that you'd get, say, from adding an air stone bubbler. It doesn't necessarily have to be sort of that violent reaction. There just has to be some agitation of the surface. Obviously, the higher the agitation, the more gases is going to be exchanged. Now, in the planted tank, obviously, because we like having CO2 in our tank, it's quite important that we don't gas out too much, especially if we're injecting it in, because then we're just feeding the air. So having that violent bubbling at the surface is really gassing out some of our CO2. Now, it is, again, absorbing oxygen, but we want, obviously, the CO2 to be as available to the plants as possible. So at least having some surface agitation to allow that gaseous exchange, because of course we still need oxygen in our tank for our fish to breathe, and again then for our plants to breathe in the dark periods when photosynthesis switches and it's breathing in oxygen and putting out CO2, rather than the daytime where it's breathing in CO2 and putting out oxygen. With gaseous exchange in mind, again, how I talked about in stiller waters, the striation of levels within the water is more prevalent. So again, if at the surface we've got the gaseous exchange where the CO2 is being released and it's absorbing oxygen, without good flow to circulate that oxygen around, again, we're going to end up having areas of higher concentration of CO2 near the bottom and higher concentrations of O2 near the top, and it's going to be an oxygen depleted area in the bottom. And we see this at times with our fish. You know, when we talk about, okay, have we added, perhaps injected too much CO2, or is there not enough aeration in our tank? We see that the fish are going up to the surface gasping for air. Now, of course, it's not because they're trying to breathe the air. That's not the way they work biologically. What they're doing is they're coming into that upper strata where there's a higher concentration of oxygen from that gaseous exchange that hasn't been circulated throughout the tank and properly, and so that is where they're trying to respirate properly and absorb as much as they can, because down low they're in an area of oxygen depletion. And so we see that it's necessary then to have a flow that's creating a circular pattern so that it's allowing that gaseous exchange from the top to circulate down through the entire tank and breaking up that striation so that we have an even distribution of carbon dioxide and an even distribution of oxygen in the same way that where you're looking for that even distribution of temperature and even distribution of any fertilization that we may add to the tank. So of course, while we want that cycling to be going on in our tanks, we want to be maintaining that flow that's coming around. Typically, we are going to have, in best practice, our intake and our outflow on the same side of the tank. Now, there's going to be different manifold setups and everything that might sort of change that flow situation, but typically that's usually this type of filtration that we're looking at. And the reason for this, again, is because it's designed in such a way, our filters are designed in such a way with that proper flow in mind, having the water enter into our tank, cycle around the entire tank, and come back and come into the intake. So out and then in. Surprise, surprise. There's some problems with some of the filter designs in achieving that flow, I find. I'm not a fan of hang-on back filters, say in a plant-to-tank situation especially. In a fish keeping situation, it's they can be useful as well. I'm just not as sold on them. I do have them on one or two tanks, but I've supplemented them with power heads. The reason why I'm saying this, to sort of cut to it, is just by the design of the way the flow occurs. It's just conducive, unfortunately, to having some dead areas in your tank. Now, the reason I say this typically is because we have our HOB, our hang-on back filter, that is cascading water down. Now, that water, it tends to come down and flow down into the tank, and it is creating that cyclical flow that's allowing the fresh water to come down and bring up the water from the bottom. However, in a tank situation like this, where we're looking at the hole, it tends to come down and most of its flow is directed this way. Now, of course, there is going to be some dissipation as it spreads out in this direction. However, most of the flow is focused down and up and around, and there's a little bit more of a, let's say, a passive wash that comes to the other parts of the tank. I find that hang-on back filters really do tend to create quite a few dead spots, typically in the front and rear corners of your tanks. Just the water does not get a significant circulation, I find, from hang-on back filters. It's just not as directed of a flow. And so that can be problematic, again, for spreading the nutrients and for keeping detritus from settling into areas. And I found, at least through experience, most of the time when I'm using hang-on back filters, I tend to definitely get those dead areas of heavy detritus in the corners of my tanks, and that's where I get a lot of my algae beginning, and green dust algae, if I'm going to have any, is going to be in those areas again, because the way the flow comes down and just passively dissipates off to the side while it's being brought back into the intake, so it's cyclical this way, and it doesn't really consider the width of your tank or the length of your tank in that type of flow. Now, some of this can be mitigated by having two hang-on back filters, that are going, because then you are creating a space of wider circulation. But again, just by its basic design, it leads to passive diffusion of that flow in the center with an active cyclical flow just in that areas. And having two hang-on back filters typically only works on larger tanks, because, I mean, if you're working with something like a 20 gallon or even as much as a 40, having two hang-on back filters doesn't necessarily work in the way they sort of fit. And hang-on back filters, again, depending, of course, on how high or how low you leave your water level, it does create a lot of surface agitation. The way that I fix the situation, or try and fix the situation, is by inserting power heads into a tank that has a hang-on back filter in the same place that I would be putting my outflow from a canister filter. So essentially I'm trying to recreate that same sense of flow that comes naturally from a canister filter, and this is why personally I prefer canister filters in the planted tank, this among a number of other reasons. But canister filters tend to lend themselves more naturally to creating the type of flow that we require in our tanks. Now the reason for, again, supplementing the flow in a hang-on back situation with a power head being very similar to the outflow of the canister filter, what it allows to happen is no longer is it that active circulation with passive diffusion off to the side. You're able to create by placing your power head usually in the front corner and angling down towards the center middle of the glass, you are able to start creating that cyclical flow as that power head or your canister filter outtake flows down to this portion of the glass. It dissipates actively and is spread across the entire surface of your glass if you've got obviously the proper amount of flow, and then it's able to pick up the detritus and move the detritus from those front corners, and then it cycles around the side of the shorter ends of the tank, again being able to move that detritus and move the nutrients into those corners of your tank. Again, something to consider is your livestock, your fish. Different fish obviously prefer different flow rates. There are loaches and plecos and danios come from typically river systems, and so they appreciate the high flow, and you'll see them playing around and they love it. And then other fish such as some angels and some of your tetras come from a stiller water situation, and so they don't appreciate the flow as much. And it you want to make sure that as you're creating a good circulatory flow for your tank, that you're not creating a maelstrom for just tossing your fish willy-nilly around, because obviously it's going to stress them out. They're not going to be happy about that, and you'll find some of those more still water fish hiding out a little bit more. So again, it's finding the balance that's going to help keep your water circulated for your plants, but also not be either over-circulated or under-circulated for your fish. Now, I'm not talking about a river tank situation where you want that high flow because you've got fish that are used to that high flow, but circulation in your tank in terms of that horizontal flow is actually very beneficial for the fish, not only in the fact that you're creating temperature, a stable temperature across your whole tank, and stable oxygenation across your whole tank, but because our fish come from areas obviously naturally where they've got large areas to swim in, when they're in our tanks, no matter how large our tanks are, it's definitely not as large as the areas they're used to, and so they don't necessarily get the same level of exercise that they would as in the wild. Now, creating that flow situation does allow the fish to have some sort of resistance as they're swimming in the water, and so not just ones that like playing in that high flow, but any sort of fish, that resistance created by the circulation in the water keeps their bodies healthy, keeps them moving properly, and gives them the exercise necessary. I've seen plenty of fish in very low circulation situations, where you start to notice deformities in their tails. You start to notice that their swim bladders are going off, and again, it's because they're not being exercised the way that they should be. So thanks for sticking with me. Sorry, I know I might have been rambling a little bit here and there, flailing my arms wildly, and I might have dipped off camera a few times as I was showing you the tank. But it's just because flow to me in the planted tank and in the aquarium hobby in general is of the utmost importance. Whether you're doing a low-tech situation or a high-tech situation, there's a lot of things that are very important as well. But water flows. Healthy water moves. You know, if you see a swamp or something with stagnant water, yes, I mean it's a biosystem that it's necessary, but it's a dank, it's a dark, it's a dirty, and that's not what we're technically trying to create in the aquarium hobby. Healthy water is water that's in motion. By its very nature, water flows, and that's why circulation, again, in my mind, is one of the most important things that we have to consider in the planted tank. Again, it keeps detritus from selling. It keeps opportunistic algae from finding those dead zones and feeding on that. It gives algae less chance to actually hold on to things. You know, algae doesn't like being disturbed. It helps the gaseous exchange in our tank to make sure that the CO2 and the oxygen are cycling throughout the whole water as it should, feeding our fish and our plants that basic element that they need. It's moving the fertilizers that we spend so much money on and dump into our tank. It's making the most use of them by spreading them evenly throughout your tank. In a natural, a low-tech situation, you know, the naturally occurring CO2 that's coming from our plants, make the most use of it. You know, we're not paying for any of the extra injected CO2, so we've got just the most naturally occurring source. And so if you want to have lush growth, take the benefit of the naturally occurring CO2 and make sure that it's actually being dissipated throughout the entire tank and part of that gaseous exchange. In a high-tech situation, again, we're paying a lot of money or enough money for that CO2 that we're injecting. Make sure that it's being dissipated throughout the entire tank and we're making the best use out of it, and we're not sort of throwing it away just on areas. Flow is just so important in this hobby. So again, thanks for watching. Please do hit subscribe down there. You know, the channel's been growing, and that's fantastic, and it's you know, really giving me a great push for the new year. I've said it over the last few videos, there's some amazing things coming up this year that I'm so excited that you don't want to miss. And this isn't just some sort of bait and switch teaser. There's a great build coming up. Myself and another person in the hobby, another YouTuber, we're in the planning stages right now of a really cool build that I'm excited about because I've never got to do one before. That's all I'm going to say for the moment, but you're going to want to stay tuned. I've got more videos coming out of sort of the foundations in aquascaping, the things that we need to know and understand the basics of. Again, I've got a big scape coming up. Some of you have seen some of that manzanita wood that I got in that last video, and so I'll be doing a scape video of that, a nice glamour shot. Nothing like some good solid aquarium porn there, getting a look at some plants and some water and some wood and some rocks, getting all thrown together into the mix. But there's a lot of fun stuff coming up, so please do hit subscribe, keep coming back, share these around. The more the merrier, because again, as I said, the more people I can get, the sooner I can start doing some giveaways, which I want to do. Please do comment below. I always like seeing the comments, questions and everything like that. Stimulate discussion. Always be respectful on the forums or on my page. You know, we're all in this together. We're every step of the way we're learning. Those of us who've been in it for a long time are constantly learning. Those of us who are just starting out are just learning. So, you know, have fun with it. Hit that subscribe. Stay tuned for some great stuff coming up, and dive right in.